Cool. So it should be live. So I'll say we're starting our next panel of Science for a Sustainable Arctic. Now up, we've got changes to Arctic coastal social ecological systems. And that's being moderated by Hugues Lantuit. So Hugues, please take it away. Hugues, you're still on mute.
Thank you very much, Alan, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending where you are in the world looking at the stream. My name is Hugues Lantuit. I'm a researcher at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. I'm also a member of the IASC Cryosphere Working Group and the coordinator of a EU project called Nunatariok, which focuses on the impacts of climate change on permafrost coast, both from a physical and social standpoint. That said, I'm not the star of that panel. The star of the panel are our 4 panelists, and I'm very pleased to welcome them today, as well as our participants, which are quite a bit. We gathered now, those 4 panelists are Megan Sheremata, Gunn-Britt Retter, Sunna Björk, Ragnarsdóttir, and Tatiana Degai. This panel focuses on the coastal system, so Arctic coastal social-ecological systems. And this is quite important because 1/3 of the coasts of the world are located in the Arctic. And coastal science often falls between the cracks. We look at the coast from a marine or from a terrestrial or an atmospheric perspective, but not necessarily for the coast as such. I am therefore very grateful that we can host such a panel focusing on the coast itself and hear from our panelists, which come from very different backgrounds, what is the international perspective on processes impacting that coast currently and in the future. And without further ado, we will start. I will let the panelists introduce themselves in 2 minutes. I will be very strict on the 2 minutes. I have my timer right next to me. And then we'll open the panel for questions. I will start by asking the panelists very few questions, and then I'll open the floor to the attendees. I think by now, most of you know the tools at your disposals. There are some raise hands tools, and if we get lost in the process, Alan will jump in to help us out with the technical side of things. Now let's start alphabetically, and we'll start with Tatiana and her introduction.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you for inviting me to talk on this, to be part of this panel. My home is Pacific coast of Russia, Kamchatka Peninsula. And I wanted to, my technology is not working well, but I wanted to, to show this this photograph. Oh, you cannot really see it well here. This is a Sea of Okhotsk coast. This is homeland to Itelmen people, to my community. This is where my grandmother was born. And we are salmon people, heavily subsist on fishing resources and the resources of this rich Sea of Okhotsk. When you look at this picture, you would think it is some kind of resort place, you know, somewhere in the Bahamas. At least I see it this way. And that's how we view. That's how it looks in a very good warm weather when you go out and pick mussels and or clams in the mouth of the river when it meets the Okhotsk Sea. Kamchatka is home to, this is the only place remaining on Earth that has all 6 species of Pacific wild salmon coming to spawn. And we're very much engaged into salmon conservation through the use of indigenous knowledge. And that's what we're working on a lot back at home. But I'm also a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Northern Iowa in the Arctic Center, where we work on the sustainability issues, knowledge co-production, indigenous knowledge, role in the discussion of the of our future in this changing road. Now stop here. Thank you.
Perfect, right on time, Tatiana. That's really German, I would say. Very organized, perfectly on time. So the next person I would like to do, we're going alphabetically, is Sunna. So Sunna, the floor is yours. You can introduce yourself, your position, and what your interest in that question is.
Thank you, Hugh. So yeah, my name is Sunna Björk Ragnarsdóttir. I'm a marine biologist. I work for the institute, the Icelandic Institute of Natural History. And that institute is charged with maintaining a pretty broad overview of nature conservation and natural resource allocation, as well as providing then advice and instructions thereon. It also has a very broad monitoring and educational role. I take part in habitat mapping in the intertidal according to UNIS, the European Nature Information System. I also take part in assessing the conservation value of protected areas where there are coastal areas within the sites. I construct advice and instructions on responsible use of coastal areas to avoid degradation of important habitat types. Then I also take part in doing work necessary to implement the Water Framework Directive here in Iceland, along with a lot of other institutes. And finally, and maybe most relevant for the talk that we're having here today, I am a part of the Coastal Steering Group of the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, which is an initiative of the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, or CAF, so that most of you probably know. So the goal of this coastal group within CAF is to promote, facilitate, and coordinate and harmonize coastal biodiversity monitoring activities among the circumpolar countries and permanent participants. And on top of that, we aim to improve the ongoing communication amongst and between, of course, scientists as well, and then community experts, indigenous knowledge holders, manager and disciplines, then both, of course, inside and outside of the Arctic. Yeah, maybe then more on the personal note. I am from a very coastal area in the northeast of Iceland. Grew up on a farm, so I am very used to fishing and using that habitat both in to sustain us and also in that social environment as well. So within my 2 minutes, isn't it, Hugh?
Pretty much. I'm not gonna blame you. I usually always go over my 2 minutes.
Yeah. Then I just talk faster. I don't actually shorten anything if I think I'm going over time.
I will have plenty of time to explain whatever we want to explain afterwards through the Q&A with the audience. Gunn-Britt.
Yes, thank you. I guess I'm here since I'm the head of the Arctic and Environmental Unit of the Saami Council, which is an indigenous peoples organization with cross-national border constituency, as we have member organizations in Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Northwest Russia. We operate on the international level in the UN and as permanent participant to the Arctic Council. The Saami people is mostly known as reindeer herders, for its reindeer husbandry. It is less known that we are also coastal people. So I guess I'm here also since I belong to the coastal part of Sápmi. I have lived all my life by the Varangi Fjord in northeast Norway. I believe the only major fjord in Norway that opens towards the east. It is located 70 degrees north and as far east as Istanbul in Turkey, and it is ice-free all year round. And here you also find the cultural historic site of Tseftsgergi, Mortensnes, which shows that the area has been settled since the ice retreated 10,000 years ago. People traditionally settled at the seashore as there was always access to food. They caught and utilized the resources that were available at the time without thinking about strategies to adapt to gradually changing environment, knowing that no year is equal to the other, and not taking more than they could handle and process. And this was long before quotas for fishing were invented or any science for counting fish stocks was developed. So some kind of self-management and governance system must have been in place, as we are still here, depending on the productivity of the very same ecosystems. This, I believe, is sustainability in practice, and also circular economy in practice. Over all these generations of settlement, a considerable knowledge has been built up and developed to build and develop our societies. We like to call it indigenous knowledge. This has less place in present decision-making that has been taken over by national authorities. The call to make use of indigenous knowledge also means engagement and participation of people at the community level, the knowledge holders. We definitely have something to contribute on sustainability in the Arctic, and we need science that builds our societies as well. And we need flexibility in management systems in times of rapid change. And I think that was the introduction to where I come from.
Thank you very much, Gunn-Britt. Thank you to all of you for keeping in on time. And I'm sure that Megan will do the same in her introduction. Megan, the floor is yours.
I will try. Thank you. And thanks, everyone. It's a real honor to be part of this panel. Thanks to ASSW or to the organizing committee for inviting me to this wonderful group. I am a 2019 IASC fellow, a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in Canada, and I'm working with Inuit knowledge holders primarily in 4 communities: Kujarapik, Umuyak, and Inukjuak, which is in Nunavik, which is in northern Quebec, and Sanikiluak, which is out on the Belcher Islands of Nunavut. And together we're working to describe the cumulative impacts of environmental change in coastal systems in Eastern Hudson Bay, which began in the 1970s with the development of a very large hydroelectricity development project, the James Bay Project. It's still one of the largest hydro development projects in the world. So they've been experiencing environmental change for a very long time, because this development has introduced lots of fresh water in the middle of winter, transforming salinity and sea ice and Inuit land use in the region, as well as weather systems, currents. Ultimately, everything began to change then. And then in the 1990s, this has been compounded by the impacts of global climate change. And I mentioned some of these specifics of my work because many Indigenous peoples, including Inuit in Eastern Hudson Bay, have been dealing with environmental change for a very long time. And where I work, Inuit have been leading research since the 1980s. And so a key goal of our work together and for my research is really to learn from Inuit knowledge and to bring that together with the sciences, sort of moving away from this model of, integrating knowledge more towards learning from and collaborating with, so that to support my partners' interests in science that serves their priorities, and in building constructive connections at the science policy interface so that the environmental sciences can better serve the decision-making and land use priorities of Inuit. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Megan. I would advise our participants, so not the panelists, but the participants, to start listing up your questions if you have some in the chat or in the little box that is dedicated to that, so that we can start with them as soon as we're done with the first set of questions, and I can list them here. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to select them. I don't think it's going to be first come, first serve. It's going to be whichever one we pick up as probably the most engaging in the box as it pops up here. But let me start here with a couple of
Sorry to interrupt for a second. Just a small clarification. Please use the Q&A box for questions, not the chat box. It just helps us keep a better track of them. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess there is a national version because I get it as a Fragen und Antworten. So that's going to be your translation. Yeah, the title of the session is really like the coupling of the social and ecological systems at the coast. And I see that all four of you probably have different perspectives because of the place you come from the topic you've been looking at. So I would like to some extent to ask each of you a question related to that coupling. Let's start maybe with Sunna. You're a marine biologist, and you are involved both in national settings and in international initiatives. How would you say that that coupling is translating into your research, or how your research is actually being used by both social, ecological, political institutions, or even social context in the coastal zone?
Thank you, Hugh. I think in general terms, the ecosystem services assessments have a very high potential to support decision-making, both here and internationally. But I do think that here in Iceland, we are lagging a bit behind when it comes to linking these vital ecosystem services to policymaking and governmental decisions. And I do think that's mainly due to the complexity of these systems. So Arctic coastal ecosystems, they form series of social ecological systems that include coastal components of other systems, marine, freshwater, terrestrial. And of course, they are interacting with each other and heavily interacting with the people that live there. So these social ecological systems meet and interact in complex ways. And that influences their compositions, the structure, functions, and the capacity to support a very wide range of Arctic coastal biodiversity. But then again, that biodiversity is then threatened by a diversity of interacting environmental drivers as well as anthropogenic stressors. So there is some difficulty for the player or an outsider, like most politicians are, to understand these complex processes and interactions that underscores the need for comprehensive and sustained monitoring of coastal ecosystems.
So would you say that challenge that you are saying that, or maybe you are using the word, we may be lagging behind, this is an issue in articulating probably a better connection with the policy arena, or do you think this is simply because we don't have the capacity? Do we have the coastal scientists, let's say, that we need in the Arctic region to achieve that?
I do think this, yeah, it's a very good point, because I think this is twofold. I think on one hand, we are just lacking in the research area as well, because we don't have, for example, here in Iceland, we are not doing enough studies where we are looking at this interaction, the social ecological interactions in the coastal areas on one hand. And then on the other hand, we are missing more communications between the knowledge holders, whether they are scientists or indigenous knowledge holders, with then the government, the governmental structure. So I do think the vital work then is to encourage the communication between everyone. And with that, we would have an easier aim towards a goal that would also sustain, getting more money into research. So it would be easier to maintain some more permanent type of monitoring.
So communication is a key word. This is something that Megan is looking at critically, I think, on her field sites in northern Canada. And I'm curious as to her vision or her perception of what how these dynamics take place at the coast. Specifically, I think, Megan, what you're interested in is taking maybe a critical or also a positive sometimes look at how researchers interact with residents. And I was wondering whether that takes a spatial kind of aspect in a coastal context, or if you don't need to differentiate that.
It's a big question to answer. And, when we sometimes in the science world, we think about, I'm actually starting to move away from a social ecological lens, because sometimes that lens doesn't really afford what comes out of the relationships that I'm building with knowledge holders. So Inuit in Eastern Hudson Bay have been leading research since the 1980s because they've been dealing with significant impacts for a long time. And since the 1980s, they've shared with me a lot of lessons learned. They actually have training for young hunters to learn how to communicate with scientists who come to their community. Sorry, that was my son. And so they have science communication training in their hunting organizations for young hunters so that those young hunters can learn to communicate with visiting researchers. This is something that is much more recent in the scientific community in terms of training young early career researchers to communicate and do maybe citizen science work in communities. And it's something that many researchers know nothing about. So there are important legacies of research that I think can tell us about the kinds of relationships that Indigenous communities want to have with researchers. And what's coming out, internationally, what we've been talking about maybe for the last decade or so more critically. And when I say critically, this is an opportunity. It's sort of looking at what is invisible to us in the research community and opening it up and trying to see what we're not paying attention to. And a lot of that involves these relationships with Indigenous peoples at the science policy interface. And, many of us are aware we're not seeing enough Indigenous representation at all levels. And in the Arctic, communities are very small. So there's not a lot of time for my research partners to come here and talk about this for themselves. So that puts a lot of us researchers in an inordinately powerful position that is very difficult to reconcile. My partners, I do work for Inuit hunting organizations, decision makers, wildlife managers, and that tension is something I critically think about constantly. It's a big part of my work. I'm in a Department of Environmental Sciences, but I'm now doing a lot of work in the social sciences and humanities even, in order to rigorously evaluate my role as a researcher. And that's something that most people in the sciences just aren't prepared to do. But it's a big part of the work that is in front of us all if we're effectively going to improve those relationships at the science policy interface and achieve this idea of knowledge co-production, which I think more and more people are talking about, which involves the equitable production of research that Inuit in Canada have asked that research be done by them, or if that's not possible, with them. And so I'm in an ideal situation where, Inuit have been leading research since the 1980s. And I think learning from their experiences is an important one, bringing out those experiences. And I think for the scientific community at large, to be looking at Inuit and Indigenous methodologies, which is something some of us within IASC are really hoping will happen, so that scientists can be thinking about the ways in which Indigenous peoples are conceiving of research, how Indigenous peoples would like to see research be conducted, and in turn, I think, how Indigenous people see their land, which, as Gunn-Britt mentioned, and my community partners mention all the time, is not confined to the coast. My partners understand a tremendous amount about marine systems, very distant from their communities, even though we often think of Indigenous knowledge as simply local knowledge. Similarly, my partners see a lot happening, or at least they're impacted a lot by activities in terrestrial systems. So these dividing lines aren't very clear. And once we start, learning from Indigenous knowledge. So I've moved away from the idea of integration towards thinking of myself as someone in the sciences who's learning from Indigenous peoples. What can I learn about terrestrial systems and their impacts on coastal environments, instead of trying to integrate that knowledge, sort of seeing myself still as a scientist who's producing knowledge, but that is based on learning sort of across worldviews. And, you know, as I was mentioning, there's just a lot of methodological work in doing that kind of learning robustly and producing research with communities in ways that are really different, I think, than we've been doing historically in social ecological research.
Thank you very much. I think that goes straight into the question I wanted to go to Gunn-Britt, because Gunn-Britt has been, I think, an advocate of indigenous participation. That's the word you used, Gunn-Britt. And I am curious to say, actually, I really liked your introduction about the fact that the Saami indeed are very much identified with that continental, if you wish, cliche or prejudice about the ways they are embracing the landscape. And I think this is quite different. So I'm curious to, maybe for us to tell you the story of the Saami and the coast, because this is quite interesting. And then maybe to go on your experience of the policy arenas to see how that indigenous dimension is having an influence on policies devised at the coast.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, I think, yeah, it's less known that the Saami are also coastal people, and my answer will, of course, reflect on that. We are placed in the Nordic countries, and of those, it's Russia and Norway that has mostly coastal Saami settlements. And I know, of course, Norway best. So I think the coastal perspective is often disappearing in the bigger discussions. And in particular, when we see the Norwegian government is switching the focus from towards oceans, and also in the Arctic discussions, it's like the high Arctic and then the Arctic discussions. And then they put a lot of, and also in the international level, I would say the Sustainable Development Goals or in the UN discussions, the oceans are a bigger discussion and bigger question, if I would say, than coastal. And I was wondering when I was preparing for this that at the coast, that's where the people are living. So I guess the people might be a complicating factor for scientists and also for policymakers. But of course, on the terrestrial, there is also people is a factor, but you can also focus on, yeah, people being a component, of course, in the terrestrial research, but you can also, I guess, avoid it. But in the coastal zone, there is definitely people involved and also social and economic questions. Actually, the Food and Agriculture Organization is the one I know that has actually taken this seriously and invited to an expert seminar on traditional knowledge and indigenous peoples' fisheries in the Arctic region last fall in Rome. So this is definitely something, a track we need to follow up as Saami people as well. There was quite a number of both Inuit and Saami experts that attended that meeting, and also a big number of indigenous peoples from Russia. So I think this is a very good initiative by the FAO. But also Sunna here mentioned the CAF's Coastal Monitoring Group, and that's also one where we have nominated one of our experts to participate, to contribute with our knowledge to address our needs. Because I think in all this, the baseline is to figure out how coastal people, including Saami and others, are to live through these changes that we are facing. So that should be the bottom line. The other challenge, if I just quickly approach, is that back to Norway again and the focus on high north policies is this, and which I wanted to address in the earlier panels today, but I didn't bother to take the floor, is when, yes, when Norway is focusing on high north and knowledge development, they give a lot of funding to polar scientists and polar research. So you are actually increasing the gap between the Saami knowledge institutions and Saami knowledge holders and the Arctic, what they call the Arctic knowledge production and put it up into the ocean and the ice edge, trying to avoid people. So one of my strong recommendations always, and also at this panel, is we need all support possible to encourage also strengthening of Saami and other indigenous peoples' institutions, so we can be meaningfully participating in the knowledge production that happens in these areas. Just like Megan also told here, that we have the knowledge, indigenous peoples have the knowledge, and we are doing this science, but it's pretty much depending on small organizations or individuals, and we can't live in that kind of world. So we have to also build and strengthen our knowledge institutions.
Good message heard. Tatiana, I want to switch to you, because this is a continuum between we've been hearing our three panelists and what you're doing. You're actually now involved in a brand new NSF project that is involving quite a few countries, if I understood well, and is looking at the impacts of coastal change at your home region, on your home region, sorry. And I'm curious about that, because we are in an international framework on that panel. This is IASC, and we are promoting work between the countries that are doing work in research in the Arctic. How do you see the involvement of international researchers in your own region? Is it a challenge, a chance? The narrative about international involvement can differ quite a bit from one country to the other, so it's legitimate to have different approaches to that. How do you see that?
I really love the discussion that I hear, and I really want, you know, I'm in support of everything what's been said before me, especially in regards to the indigenous people's knowledge envisioned as part of the science nowadays. We started Arctic Center. As part of Arctic Center, we are now part of this international project that the official title is Arctic Robust Communities Navigating Adaptation to Variability. It is an interdisciplinary research conducted by different institutions within the United States, and also we're having indigenous knowledge holders as our also main experts and partners, and conducting research together with us. This research is aimed at looking at the sea ice change in the Bering Strait, in Alaska, Chukotka, and north of Kamchatka. We're looking in 6 different locations, 2 in each region. So we want to see how sea ice variability that is occurring much stronger right now, how it influences the communities on the ground and how they transform to this change. And we're looking at this through the prism of different disciplines. We have oceanographers, physical scientists, social sciences, and indigenous knowledge holders working together to understand how people perceive change in sea ice and how they adapt to the variability in ice conditions. We want to see where the critical hotspots of variability in sea ice are right now. We also want to see how governmental and non-governmental organizations in the region navigate change in sea ice conditions and interact with communities to respond to their needs. And I think if I go back to the question of international cooperation, it is a challenge logistically, but I think we have a lot to learn from each other, both between the institutions within the United States, but also between the institutions that partner with us in Russia between the knowledge holders. We have, to our project, we have advisory board where we have representatives of the from the communities, kind of validating the project's activities, looking and advising us on how we could go further more effectively. This project is rather young. We were planning to conduct some fieldwork and cross-cultural exchange this summer, but we all are now affected. So we had to cancel in order to, secure health of everybody, and especially of those knowledge holders in the communities within the current situation. But it's exciting. I've been actually focusing on literature right now, and I already see that there is a lack of indigenous knowledge expertise in this literature, where they say we're missing this data or this data, while monitoring, for example, the sea mammal population on the coast, and I pretty clearly see that it had they used indigenous knowledge holders or hunters, sea mammal hunters, they would probably had more accurate data in their articles that I'm reading right now. Thank you.
So if I hear you, for a project that even for a project that is focusing on sometimes very local knowledge, it would be beneficial to have international participation, but the challenge might be to learn how to do it. And that is where we have to do our homework. And I've seen a lot of people nodding in the panel when you were positively assessing the international collaboration. So I think everyone is positively inclined, but probably looking at ways to do it. I think I'm gonna look at the questions that have been asked here. The first one is a fairly generic one, and one that you're getting pretty much all the time, I'm sure, Gunn-Britt, but I think Apollo, I don't know if it's a code name or someone real, but Apollo is asking you, how do the Saami people live with the effects of climate change?
Yeah, thank you. I think I briefly touched upon that in my introduction as well. So the key to living with climate change is flexibility. And that is what our culture historically traditionally has been based upon. It's that we didn't depend on one species for fisheries, for example. We depend on a diversity of them. And if the fisheries fail, you always have other things to do on shore, or small scale farming, or other kind of economy. So the traditional way of coping with change is that something we have been living with all the time, is to have a diversity of economies, so to say, that you can adapt or switch between to adapt to changes. And some economies might be more preferable than others, but you will always know that you can't trust in the Arctic only one species, because that might fail. So you have to have other legs to stand upon. But why I'm bringing up the point of flexibility all the time is that I think that we feel that the present management or regulations in fisheries, for example, in the coastal and fjord areas, is putting restrictions on this flexibility, because it's a slowness in adapting regulations and laws to the changes in species. For example, it didn't come to stay, but we had 1 year with an awful lot of mackerels in Varanger Fjord, but there was no system in either receiving it or catching it or having quotas in place. It's very slow to adapt to actually having a economy out of or any commercial fishing of it. Of course, you could fish it for your own use, but we don't even like mackerels. So at least my mom doesn't. So so we also have to, I guess, develop our tastes for potential new species coming in. But I think the flexibility is the key. And also that is what management is restricting a bit. So we need to have good dialogue with the decision makers to have more flexibility in regulations and management. But of course, this is true when it's the water are still productive, but you might also have more acid water that might be more challenging. We already see that taking place, but we don't have any answers to how to cope with that case in the future.
I'm sure that we could ask the same question to Sunna. You will see the same kind of dynamics and that kind of balance between bureaucracy and taking an opportunistic or candid way at what's happening and in the waters, and seeing some new forms of life, new species that you could take advantage of and having challenges looking at it.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty hard thing to solve, I guess, because I think we want the decisions to be based on sound scientific methods and stuff like that, and that always takes a bit of a time and research. So let's say for fishing policies and stuff like that. So it's a bit, and with that time frame, it does lose a lot of flexibility because it takes a lot of time to estimate stock sizes and all that. So I totally agree with you, Gunn-Britt, that this is a discussion that we need to see where it takes us, because it is very important that we can be flexible and use the resources we have available in a sustainable way. But it is it has to be compatible with some sort of reliable method, so we can make sure that this is sustainable. So, and that also comes back to that we have to have some sort of groundwork to build upon. So, for example, some sort of holistic monitoring plan, like for coastal ecosystem, for example, like the coastal group is for CAF has actually made this Arctic Coastal Biodiversity Plan, where there are very ambitious goals for linking together by both scientific and indigenous knowledge. And now the main discussion and problem is how we are going to communicate that. How can we communicate that in a timely fashion so it can be used in a relevant time frame for decision and policymakers? Because this is, of course, a big problem that the wheel is very long. It takes a very long time to turn it. So it is, when the information is available, the data is there, it isn't necessarily relevant still.
Lots of challenges. I'm going to switch to the next question already.
And no solutions. So I am no help.
That's why we're there. Think about that. The next question is by Peter Schweitzer. I'm going to try to read the question, but there was a small correction in the box here, so that I say, a question to Gunn-Britt and Tatiana. Maybe we start with Tatiana, since Gunn-Britt just answered previously. While there is still a long way to go for full integration of indigenous knowledge into science agendas, how is the situation with including social science results into indigenous agendas in your areas? So I think it's turning that question around, is that we certainly need to be very proactive to include indigenous knowledge in science agendas, but have results from social science trickle down into indigenous agendas in your areas?
So unfortunately, there is still a huge gap between social scientists, or all kinds of scientists, and indigenous knowledge holders. And I feel like every time we meet as an indigenous person, I have to prove that indigenous knowledge is viable enough, you know, to support sustainability on our planet, especially when we talk about, you know, Chukotka and Kamchatka, where you can see very, very little research with indigenous people's participation conducted by the scholars on that part of the of our planet. Again, I think with such international collaboration, we can actually kind of promote this kind of research in Russia, and indigenous communities, make indigenous communities also, you know, feel strong about their knowledge being valuable, which is not always the case in the communities in the Pacific coast of Russia. So yeah, that would be my answer to this question.
Gunn-Britt?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, to add to that, I think, and thank you for the question. I think the indigenous peoples understand that we need science also to understand the rapid changes that we are facing, that we don't have all answers in our own indigenous knowledge. And we look to science to help us understand, in particular, because the changes are more rapid and more larger in a way than we have seen before. So I think it's a understanding there. And I also have to say, from my experience, that social scientists are often looked upon as allies for indigenous peoples, but it can also be opposite, of course, between good alliances between in social scientists and indigenous peoples, because we equally kind of push the similar agenda many times, not always, but I also have to say that also indigenous peoples are scientists, especially in the area I know best. There's a lot of Saami who are scientists themselves, so who see the need to pursue that direction as well, to address our indigenous culture's challenges. So that is also important to remember, that we are scientists ourselves, even while we also have individuals that are knowledge holders. We are also individuals who are scientists.
Good, thank you for the fairly concise answer. That is very precise, but that's great. So that allows me to jump to the next question. That came from Pierluigi Buttigieg. Maybe we'll start with Megan to start answering that question. She's really trying to bridge those different kind of fields of knowledge. The panelists have noted multiple sources of knowledge and methods. How are these sources currently organized and interlinked? I can already give the answer that there is no perfect answer to that, but.
So should I answer this question or try to? I think that speaks to much of what Tatiana and Gunn-Britt have opened up in their responses to the previous question. They're not necessarily organized in a way that, we organize data sets. They're organized as much as researchers have constructive, strong relationships with the communities and knowledge holders that they collaborate with. And there's been some really good research in Southern Canada that connect the longevity of the research relationships, as well as how much that research provides reciprocal benefits to communities. By that I mean, how much are researchers really building youth elder connections, supporting knowledge holders and their institutions, and creating capacity in research communities for Indigenous peoples in various ways. And so the longevity of relationships has a lot to do with how well the multiple sources are connected, and they're not as easily archived the way we tend to think of scientific data organized. So it's all relationships. And I think Gunn-Britt also touched on the fact that there are a lot of Indigenous scholars, and in communities that I work with, that's not necessarily the case, but I would say there's a real need to think about the next generation of scholars and building capacity for Indigenous scholars to sort of figure this out, because I think as long as there aren't very many Inuit environmental scientists, the environmental sciences will struggle to meet the needs of Inuit. But I think that also the idea of international networks and networks of Indigenous knowledge holders, this is, I think, the future, that there needs to be organizational capacity for knowledge holders to network, for hunting organizations, to work with hunting organizations. And that's something that has developed around the Hudson Bay Basin. And it's something that internationally, people like Victoria Bushman are really wanting to develop or launch an Indigenous Peoples Research Summit for Indigenous peoples across the Arctic. So I think there, and also people like Jamie Snook, who I don't work with, but he's really called for within Canada for us to fund networks of Indigenous knowledge holders the way research networks are funded, so that Indigenous knowledge holders can network with one another and discuss how best to work with us, the researchers. So these are all things that are happening. And I think as researchers, we need to find out how we can, you know, in the scientific community, how we can support those kind of initiatives.
Thank you, Megan. Gunn-Britt, I'll let you say maybe 1 minute something on it, because we have 10 minutes and I'm trying to edit those questions. Before you get on, Gunn-Britt, with this, I think many participants have asked to get references about the projects you mentioned. That is the one for you, Tatiana, the NSF project, the couple of acronyms that we mentioned. Sunna, you mentioned also the biodiversity program. Gunn-Britt, you mentioned that, even that workshop at the FAO. So if you could, like, under that, possibly put it in the chat or find a way to communicate it to the attendees here. You can send it to me by email. I don't know what you can do during the panel, but we'll try to communicate that maybe at the end of the panel to the participants. Sorry, I let you talk.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly to the last question. I agree with what was said, but this partly is also to Peter's question, which I left out, is when it's a question of if this is collected or there's a system for this knowledge, or I don't remember exactly the phrasing of the question. One of the challenges we have to keep in mind, and especially for scientists, is that the ownership of Indigenous knowledge belongs to the knowledge holder and to the community. It's often collective and it belongs to that community, and it's up to them to decide who to share it with, when to share, and so on. So there wouldn't be, if I am in can decide, there wouldn't be any database available where you can pick and choose what matches your science and so on. So this is not the way we want Indigenous knowledge to be used. It should be considered as a separate way of understanding and knowing that, and that will either be separate alongside with science or co-production of new knowledge, but it shouldn't be a place where it's gathered to be picked and chosen from. Thank you.
Thank you for this very clear message. So I'm going to try, it's a challenge here. We have many education touching questions touching about resilience, education, but I'll start with the two first ones. So we're necessarily going to forget some dimension. I'll apologize in advance to the participants. And I'm going to try to bring together the two next questions and ask each of you to answer that. We have 8 minutes left. So the first question is, hi all, I appreciate for this great session. Questions to all panelists. What is the major driver of coastal social-ecological system change in your region of study? I think this is quite interesting here because you guys covered quite a bit of the circum-Arctic. So what is seen, or what is from your perspective, or people that live there, as the major driver of coastal socio-ecological change? And then the next question, maybe as a follow-up, how can international science best support local communities? Where is the disconnect to some extent? What are the key issues that require research where common and local scientific understanding is lacking? So how can a international dimension be a added value for issues that are local to some extent? And I add to that, and I think we'll conclude with that question. So try to be concise, about 1 or 2 minutes ish to provide answer to that question. I know this is very tricky. We start like in the beginning with Sunna.
Yeah, well, these are very big questions, aren't there? And the major driver, I think, is always going to be anthropogenic stressors, and then on the other hand, we're going to have climate change. So if you're going to say the major drivers, it's going to be them, of course. I mean, here in Iceland, almost the entire population lives by the coast. So there's always going to be quite a lot of stressors just, yeah, resulting from that. And of course, then exploitation of, yeah, that. Then the other one, the international science supporting local communities. I think Gunn-Britt hit a very good point, and this is something we discuss a lot in the coastal group within CAF, that this should not be about integrating the indigenous knowledge with the scientific knowledge. This should be about giving both space. So we should have, of course, the scientific knowledge, but we should also give the indigenous, the local knowledge, their own space, where we are not trying to squeeze it into some formats that it doesn't fit into. And that is a very vital part. But then we just have to figure out how, how we broadcast that knowledge. And that also always has to be in the hands of the knowledge holder, because that can very easily lose its meaning when it goes through some process that it's not meant to go through. Within 2 minutes.
Thank you. You did an amazing job, Sunna. We go. Oh, wait, I have my list here. I'm in the complete. Actually, I didn't respect the order. So let's go with Tatiana. So you remember our 2 questions?
Yeah, I can see them. So yeah, I do think that anthropogenic stresses are the main drivers of change in our societies, but I think these are guided by guided ignorance and greed. You know, hadn't human being so ignorant and self-oriented, we wouldn't be in a place that we are now. So that would be my answer to the first question. When we are talking about working with indigenous communities and trying to co-produce knowledge together, we should remember the word together. It's not the scientists above, one is not a priority over another, one system of knowledge. They are both equally important, and we need to work on recognition that to recognize that. We also, I agree with what been said before on that we need to use a different approach when we work with indigenous communities, and we need to look more into indigenous research methods. It shouldn't be research for the sake of science. It should be a research for the community, guided by the community. These are the core principle of effective research with the knowledge holders. We cannot use it as a commodity. It should be an equal partnership based on trust and, again, long-term relationships that you build with indigenous knowledge holders. But it doesn't mean that all this data is for the rest of the society to know. It might be used just for the community to develop sustainability.
Thank you, Tatiana. So you did great with Megan and Gunn-Britt. You have a bit of time to conclude here. Megan, we start with you, and then with that sword to Gunn-Britt.
I'm just going to tell you what has been told to me by the elders who I've worked with and the people who've been doing research in their community for a long time. With Stas's question, the major drivers, I mentioned hydroelectricity development, climate change, but beyond that, they say the policies that have been enacted to, say, protect wildlife in the region have, which, for example, a beluga whale hunting ban, that means that there is no more Inuit knowledge of beluga in Eastern Hudson Bay because they're unable to hunt, or at least in Southeastern Hudson Bay. So something that the ICC Alaska has said and others have said, as Gunn-Britt has mentioned, that the policies that our science informs sometimes confound Inuit capacity to live their lives as they want. So, and Indigenous peoples in general. So I think that, you know, so this is why people talk about colonialism, not really including their Indigenous perspectives in environmental policy, which is why we need to have space for Indigenous peoples to shape policy at this science policy interface. And we can make that space in science by talking about the need for these relationships to exist, not just in fieldwork, but at conferences, at discuss, you know, funding, and when we're establishing funding frameworks. It's very important so that our research doesn't, you know, perpetuate a lack of understanding of how these changes can be reduced or minimized or prevented. I think that's all I have time for.
Thank you. And then lots of pressure on you, Gunn-Britt, to conclude that panel with inspiring last words.
Oh yeah, not a lot of pressure at all. All good things have been said, so I can just add the main driver is also change in land use, but since this is coastal, it's also a change in space and in water use, like for fish farming, or even in Norway, where mining, what do you call it, tailings from mining is dumped into the fjord. So there is a great competition on the space and the area. This is driven by our own consumption, overconsumption, greed, and demands. So it's a globalization as well. And I would also like to add there, what we see in our areas is what we call green colonialism, because people are saying we have to give up this land or space because people need batteries, mining for batteries, and they need windmills and so on for the green shift. So that is just another color for the colonialism that has taken place. And to the second question, how can science best support? I think, no, I made so many notes. Yeah, I think it was already said, but ensure that we need dialogue and these meeting spaces, so we ensure that no one do any harm with their science in a way. So we don't need any bad decision making based on science. So we have to make sure that decisions that are made doesn't harm the more vulnerable groups who don't have that same space. And again, this participation, and it's not voluntarily, it should be, we should also strengthen our institutions to be able to participate in all this space that is created. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think at the nerve of the war, as usual, it comes down to our funders and whether they put that as a requirement or not, because money helps to make those kind of decisions. Thank you very much for here. We try to be concise and do that in the time imparted. There are still a lot of questions that haven't been answered that are in the chat, so I apologize to the participants for that. I want to thank very much our 4 panelists. I want to ask them explicitly to list the couple of acronyms that they mentioned to during their talk, because we want to be fully didactical, and we'll try to list them either in the chat here, or as far as I see here, we are live on YouTube. So that maybe we'll put it in the chat underneath the YouTube video, so that people have access to this kind of references. That would be extremely useful. Some participants have already listed links to their projects, and we try to put them there as well. Alan, I guess you could confirm maybe the details about the ways those videos are going to be accessible afterwards.
Yeah. So this is going to be available on YouTube in just a little bit. It'll be live with a link on the IASC channel there, and in a playlist with the rest of our Science for Sustainable Arctic videos. Thank you to all of the panelists, as well as to all of the attendees for your questions. The session is ending now, but I'll let the panelists stick around for a little bit longer. If you want to answer some of those questions directly via text in the Q&A box, I would very much welcome you to do that. Our next session is going to start in 15 minutes, and that's a session on informing Arctic marine decision making. And if you're interested in doing a little bit of online networking, I'll put our virtual coffee break room in the chat there. You'll have to leave this session to see who else might be online. You can talk with each other there and come back here for our next session in 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And